Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. At 10:16 this morning, you might want to drop, cover, and hold on. It's the Great Shakeout, a worldwide earthquake drill. While we don't have much notice when a real quake happens, preparation is key to riding it out. Today, we're talking all about earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest. But first, let's get you caught up. Flags will be lowered to half-mast on Friday in Washington state to honor 4 soldiers from Joint Base Lewis McChord. They died in the Black Hawk crash in Thurston County last month. Governor Bob Ferguson's flag order applies to all state agencies. Killed that day were Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Cully, Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Krause, Sergeant Donovan Scott, and Sergeant Jadalyn Good. The Army says the cause of the crash is still under investigation. It might cost more to drive through the Highway 99 tunnel next summer. State officials are considering raising toll rates during the FIFA World Cup. The State Transportation Commission could increase rates between 50 cents and $1 a trip. If approved, the increases would take effect between June 1st and July 15th of 2026. That's when 6 World Cup matches will be played at Lumen Field. State lawmakers have asked the commission to consider the temporary rate hikes to pay for additional expenses, like managing traffic around the stadium. And hey, speaking of big sports events, the Mariners are hosting Game 4 of the American League Championship Series at T-Mobile Park tonight against the Toronto Blue Jays. First pitch is at 5:33. Meanwhile, city leaders are hosting a rally this afternoon to celebrate the Mariners' postseason run. It begins at 2 o'clock at City Hall, remarks from Mayor Bruce Harrell. That'll be followed by a march down to T-Mobile Park with the soundtrack provided by the University of Washington Marching Band. Go M's! Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. Today at 10:16 a.m., people across the West Coast and around the world will participate in a massive earthquake drill. You probably know it. The Great Shakeout, the yearly practice, is supposed to help people keep top of mind some of the most important things to consider in the event that the earth starts shaking. Harold Tobin is director at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network. He's also a professor of seismology and geohazards at UW. Harold, glad you're here to help listeners understand what they should know about living here in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. The Pacific Northwest is earthquake country. We don't have a lot of earthquakes that we feel all the time. It's been many years since a big one happened around here. In fact, almost 25 years since the Nisqually earthquake, the most damaging earthquake in the USA in the last 30 years in the whole country. And we're second only to California in terms of the population and infrastructure at risk from earthquake damage here in Washington state.
Okay, so that is setting the stage. Let's talk about the Great Shakeout. Why do we have this yearly earthquake drill on October 16th?
We have a yearly earthquake drill so that people really get a sense of what you're supposed to do, because an earthquake really comes with no warning. We don't have that preparation time that, folks in the southeast get for hurricanes, or even what we might get with a volcanic eruption. Earthquakes just happen. Shakeout happens on October 16th or October 17th, actually because it's the anniversary of the Loma Prieta earthquake in California in 1989, kind of famous World Series earthquake, which caused a lot of damage back then.
You were there.
You're right. I was a graduate student in earth sciences at UC Santa Cruz. And I was right outside of our building. The earthquake started, saw the windows of the building start shaking, tried to run away from the building, stumbled and actually fell to the ground. The shaking was so hard. But that was really a watershed experience for me personally, and I think for the country in terms of earthquake hazards.
Harold, I will make a confession. I was here during the Nisqually quake, very new to the city, actually in a parking garage downtown in Pioneer Square when the earthquake hit. Yeah. And I thought to myself, I'm from the East Coast, I thought, that feels like trucks rumbling over a bridge. You know how you kind of get that motion. And then I looked up and the light fixtures in the parking garage were swinging back and forth. And I made the complete wrong decision. I got in my car and started to drive down that spiral. I actually have a receipt for my parking for years on my desk. The guy looked at me like I was nuts, driving and paying for parking in the middle of this thing. And another guy next to me said, that felt like a 6.8. And he was on the money. That guy was on the money. Yeah. But anyway, that's a long way of saying I was unprepared. And it wasn't a watershed moment for me. And I think that I'm like a lot of people. So what should people understand about preparedness and their fear of this earthquake?
We tend to go towards the kind of the Hollywood catastrophe version of earthquakes very quickly. And maybe good news to some extent. Now, big damaging earthquakes are definitely not good news in general. But one piece of it is that the vast majority of us will come through. But we still need to be able to get through the earthquake. So my first message is you can do things to increase resilience. One is just that drop, cover, hold on. Just protect yourself from falling objects. Mostly buildings don't actually completely fall down. It's the stuff in the buildings, like those swinging light fixtures you were talking about, that actually hurt people. So do things to protect yourself from that. If you can't get under a table, that's fine. Still get low, cover your head and neck. If you're in bed, stay in bed. Put a pillow over your head, literally. Those are the things that we talk about doing. Actually, being in a car is not a bad place to be in an earthquake overall because the car protects you somewhat and you're outdoors, so mostly things aren't going to fall. Now, in a parking structure, of course, it's scarier. I would have said stay in your car, but just don't drive anywhere.
I still remember it shimmying.
Yeah, in that situation.
I really do. That was about 40 seconds, that earthquake.
Absolutely, yeah. And so 6.8, that's a very large earthquake. We haven't had one even comparable since, in fact, we haven't had a big earthquake that has really shaken Seattle hard at all. And in a way, that's unfortunate. I mean, people are going to think, why is he saying that? But, we need the reminders, I think, for people to recognize what to do. You can watch a million videos, CCTV footage of earthquakes, and people tend to panic and run. That's actually one of the best advantages of the earthquake early warning system called Shake Alert that we have now, which, can give you a little bit of even seconds of advance warning on your phone because it gets you to stop and think, oh, what am I supposed to do? As opposed to just, oh my gosh, it's shaking. Got to run.
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute.
Sure.
Let's break down the different types of earthquakes for listeners.
Yeah, in our region, we actually, they're all earthquakes. They shake the ground. They shake it either harder or less hard. But we have actually different sources of earthquakes from different types of faults. And we are cursed or blessed in the Pacific Northwest with a very active plate tectonic system. It's actually why it's beautiful here. We have big mountains. We have the sea. But what that means is there's a lot of activity. So we have the so-called big one that everybody's heard about, the potential for a magnitude 9 off of the Pacific coast where the two plates meet. It's called a subduction zone. So that's Cascadia. That's the truly big earthquake that could generate a big tsunami. But actually more likely for us here in Seattle to be the next earthquake that any of us experience is one like Nisqually. And we call those deep earthquakes, or sometimes we call them slab earthquakes. They're actually happening in the part of what used to be the seafloor of the Pacific Ocean and is now 40 miles or so directly beneath our feet. The good thing is that they're deeper, so actually the waves have a chance to kind of weaken in energy before they get all the way up to the surface. And they probably aren't much bigger than about magnitude 7, but they're right underneath us. And then the third type of earthquake is kind of our doomsday event to a certain extent, and that is something like the Seattle fault. Those are faults that are in the crust of North America, much shallower than Nisqually, right underneath our city, unfortunately, in that case. The Seattle fault actually runs east to west across Bainbridge Island, right through SoDo and near the stadiums, and then on across Lake Washington. That could produce a magnitude 7.5 or so with very, very strong shaking in the city and even a local tsunami in the Sound. That's the bad news. That would be I think that's the most damaging event for Seattle specifically, not for the state as a whole, but for Seattle specifically. But they seem to come very infrequently, maybe with thousands of years span in between them. And so the likelihood of one is relatively low in any, sort of in our lifetime.
Okay. And recent news talked about the chances of the Cascadia and San Andreas earthquake happening back to back. Let's talk a little bit about that because that sounds terrible.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a disaster movie plot, right?
It does.
In fact, it has been a disaster movie plot, linking those two up. And the reality is the Cascadia subduction zone, that is one of the most gigantic faults on the planet, extending from Vancouver Island all the way into Northern California, about where Mendocino is. And that's where the Northern San Andreas fault comes to an end. So they touch, essentially, at that point. It's at least possible that a big earthquake on one of them could change the stresses, shake up the other fault enough to trigger an earthquake, either immediately, like in seconds or minutes, or maybe in years or decades, right afterwards. So there's some geological evidence that they may have linked up in the past. I would call it some evidence as opposed to something that's really, shown to be very likely or true. But we certainly need more research on what that would be because that makes, one massive disaster that the country has to deal with, compounded by a second, essentially equally massive disaster. And that's just more to handle as a response and recovery.
Sure. All right. Well, first we would have the shaking and then the potential for a tsunami, which is the after effect of an earthquake. Which one is more dangerous?
So when we're talking about the Cascadia subduction zone, the big one, the tsunami is actually the most dangerous part of it. That's where, the thought of the greatest loss of life comes from. The tsunami has the potential, if there's a lot of people in the coastal region at the time, depends what time of year it happens and other things, of tens of thousands of casualties. So tsunamis are real killers. In terms of infrastructure and damage and things we have to pay to recover from, the shaking is the strongest part.
Okay. Let's talk about preparation here. We don't have to despair. We can prepare, right? Let's tell listeners what earthquake prep should look like here.
Yeah, I love the way you said that. Don't despair, but prepare. That's really our motto. Earthquake preparation is a number of things, and it depends on, are you a homeowner, a renter? What kind of building do you live in? Certainly, if you're a homeowner and you have a house, understand whether it was built to modern seismic codes, and if not, what the retrofitting can be. More simply than that, though, for everybody, know about drop, cover, and hold on, so what you will actually do in the event. And then ideally at home, maybe at work too, have some easily accessible basic emergency kit, light, some water, some food that's not perishable in a bag, not because you're necessarily going to evacuate after an earthquake, but because, you might not have access to the things you usually do. Your pantry is an earthquake kit to some extent, but maybe you can't get into the building. So think about those sorts of things, maybe in your car as well. And then I think the other part is don't think so much about whether your house or building is going to collapse, but what can fall on you in the event of an earthquake that's on the inside. Is there a light fixture or a big heavy piece of art that's not very well secured to the wall? Is there a bookcase full of heavy books that could fall on you on the couch? Secure that to the wall. Those are the things you can do that don't cost a lot of money and are really important.
Sure. What about the federal response? Is it different under the Trump administration right now?
So in the current administration, so far, funding has been preserved for natural hazard work in general. There, of course, have been impacts of things like the large-scale, encouragement of federal workers to quit. The restrictions on spending and travel have impacted their ability to get out and do some of that response work. The shutdown right now makes an exception for people with critical emergency response jobs, and so they're still there. I want to reassure people that we're still monitoring for earthquakes, and our federal partners are still working with us. I worry about initiatives to reduce funding for FEMA, for NOAA, which handles the tsunami warning systems. We need those to be programs that continue, the Weather Service as well.
We actually do have an early alert warning system. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, since 2021, we've been live with the Shake Alert Earthquake Early Warning System. This is a system that uses our network of seismometers, which we have 700 across Washington and Oregon, listening for earthquakes and sending all the data back to here at UW and also to centers in California, where we can detect an earthquake that's just beginning and underway within a few seconds of the beginning of that earthquake. The shaking spreads like ripples in a pond from the epicenter. And so we can actually get a warning out to people before the shaking gets to them because internet communications go a lot faster than seismic waves, it turns out. With the Shake Alert system, you might expect a mobile phone message. We also have direct messaging to some critical infrastructure. If your phone lights up with an earthquake warning message, that's telling you might expect shaking within a few seconds.
Wow.
Maybe a minute, if it's a faraway earthquake with very strong shaking coming at you, but it could be just a few seconds. But again, that's just enough time to remember, what am I supposed to do? Drop, cover, and hold on. Don't try to run outside because those bricks from the facade of the building might be the thing that's coming down on the sidewalk.
That's what happened in Pioneer Square.
Exactly, like we saw in Nisqually. So the Shake Alert system is very technologically advanced, and we've had an alerting event with an Orcas Island earthquake back in March. System worked well under that condition. It also worked. Now, it wasn't a very large or at all damaging earthquake, but it showed us that the system works well.
Once the shaking stops after an earthquake, what are the next steps you should take?
As an individual, obviously you look around and make sure that you are physically safe. It might mean just stay outside of the buildings, and we expect aftershocks after any big earthquake. So be ready that there could be more shaking, hopefully not as big as the first one, but Aftershocks can include even larger earthquakes than the first one that happens. Pay attention to that. If you smell gas leaking and you know how to turn off the gas, do that. Don't turn off the gas if you don't smell gas leaking, because you might not get it back on for a long time. And sometimes the earthquake is not as damaging as we might think. Look around you and make sure your neighbors are okay. I mean, I think that's actually the most important thing. We will expect aid to be coming in no matter where we are, even in the biggest earthquakes. So I don't think people will be left on their own forever. But on the other hand, especially in a rural area, that 2 weeks ready advice is not bad advice, because it might take a while for somebody to get there.
Okay, and that's being prepared for 2 weeks without assistance.
Exactly.
All right. We've talked about a lot of things, and you've already lived through an earthquake. You called it a watershed moment. You stayed on the West Coast to study quakes. Knowing everything you know, how do you think about the earthquake risk in your daily life?
Well, I live here, right in Seattle. We don't want that to be debilitating. I think the Pacific Northwest is a wonderful place to live. There are natural hazards in lots of places in the world. Our earthquake risks exist and are real. Fortunately, they don't come very often. I actually believe that the preparedness is making us resilient to earthquakes. We have a long way to go, but we're going to come through without it being necessarily the level of apocalyptic event that some people really are afraid is coming. I don't want to minimize the hazard from earthquakes. It's very, very real, but I don't think it should be debilitating in terms of going about your daily life, and it certainly isn't for me.
Let's hope that the next earthquake we see in Seattle is the rumble from the Mariners win.
Absolutely.
All right, UW seismology and geohazards professor Harold Tobin, really appreciate you coming in. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Vaughn Jones, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you soon.